Does the contingency argument get the religious anywhere? No, absolutely not. Granted, none of their arguments are any better, but this one is particularly idiotic, as is anybody who takes it seriously. Therefore, let's dive in and see just how bad this can get, and take it from me, it can get really, really, really bad. So, away we go. Here we go with one of Frank Turek's butt buddies, Tim Stratton, as he proves that he's just as dumb as Frank is. Nobody with half a clue can go through this video and not see the myriad rational problems with it, but then again, these people aren't rational and they don't have the slightest interest in reality. And that's not exactly a surprise, sadly, but it's rarely this blatant. Maybe that's why he's focused on the mentally maladjusted theists who subscribe to Frank Turek's channel. Let's just get this over with and watch Tim completely fail. It's not going to be a remote surprise, is it?
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Tim Stratton for crossexamined.org. As a theologian and apologist who often provides a cumulative case for the existence of God,
You serious?
I'm often asked to disclose my favorite argument in my repertoire. Out of the couple dozen arguments or so, consider one of my typical top 6 favorite arguments for the existence of God. This video will focus on the Leibnizian cosmological argument, also known as the argument from contingency.
And we're going to tear it apart because it, like all the rest, isn't rational in any way, shape, or form. Now, I'm going to let him explain it first, out of charity mostly, before we rip it to shreds, but to be honest, nobody ought to go into this expecting a whole lot, because the only way you can get to anything remotely, I don't want to say credible because it's not, believable? Well, not if you're not already a Christian. Otherwise, it's just nonsense. Maybe the best we can do is tolerable. The most tolerable. The only way you can get to anything remotely tolerable is if you already believe the basics behind the Christian view, and that's kind of dumb to begin with. So go ahead, Tim. Keep on. You're already on the way down as it is.
Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was a German philosopher, mathematician, and a metaphysician, and also an expert in logic who is recognized for his independent invention of the differential and integral calculus.
So what? Now, you'll see this a lot, not just from the religious, from lots and lots and lots of other mental midgets, where they'll try to build up their source with glowing claims and reviews, instead of just letting their work stand on its own. In fact, if you remember way back on that Science of Theology video that I did, a theist showed up in the comments and their only argument was, well, the priest went to some prestigious universities. Okay, so what? That doesn't make anything that the priest said true. That's purely fallacious. Of course, this isn't about truth. It's about the impression of truth. It's the impression of trustworthiness, and that doesn't actually mean anything. It doesn't matter what else Leibniz did when it comes to this particular argument. It either stands or it falls on its own merits. And I think we're going to see it fall quite catastrophically. So let's see if I'm right.
He also crafted an argument for the existence of God that continues to be discussed today by leading philosophers in academia.
Well, not really. Not outside of Christian circles, at least. At least, I've never heard it. Now, we're going to see exactly why this falls apart in a second, once Tim here stops bobbing on Leibniz's dick. This is why when you see anyone trying to build up somebody before actually showing why they deserve it, it's almost always certain that it's a straight con. Either his argument is good and demonstrably so, or it's crap. So let's see which one it turns out to be.
Consider the deep thoughts of Leibniz one step at a time. Premise 1. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause.
Well, maybe. While ultimately it might have an explanation, that doesn't mean that you know what that explanation is. That explanation only comes about through the evidence that you can demonstrate that you have in your evaluation. This is really where they start to go entirely wrong, because they just want to know without having any actual evidence upon which to base their claims of knowledge. Just because you want it, that doesn't mean you get it. And we've talked about that a lot. How the religious really like certain explanations, mostly because they provide emotional comfort through their existing belief structure. And as such, that stuff just has to be true because, yeah, of course, fifis. But that's not how you get to actual truth, though. Just because you want it to be true, that doesn't mean that it is, and I can pretty much guarantee you that's where Tim and Leibniz are going to fail. Of course, don't take my word for it, let's just watch together and see.
2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God.
Complete and total bullshit. As I was just saying, just because a particular explanation appeals to you on a personal level, it doesn't actually mean anything. You can't state an explanation without being able to demonstrate that it is actually the explanation that is true. How is that any different from declaring the explanation to be invisible, intangible universe-creating pixies, or maybe magical farting unicorns, or anything else that you can make up in your head? It's why the standard "therefore God" line doesn't actually work. Thus, the overwhelming majority of Christian arguments completely disintegrate the second that you take a look at them with a critical eye. Because this whole thing is really just stupid.
3. The universe exists.
You can't even say that for certain. Granted, I'm willing to grant that one just for the sake of argument, but nobody actually has to. In this specific instance, the existence of the universe does absolutely nothing but pad out his bad syllogism. In fact, if I really wanted to be obnoxious about it, I could entirely dismiss the first premise because things don't have to exist in any real way to have an explanation. Harry Potter isn't real, but there's certainly an explanation for the stories that are told about him. We can actually prove that J.K. Rowling wrote the books. That's kind of the thing that you'd have to do for God if you wanted to have any kind of coherent explanation for anything. And it's really too bad they don't have that, do they?
4. Therefore, the explanation of the universe's existence is God.
The conclusion is just a restatement of an undemonstrated premise presented earlier. This whole thing is really just ridiculous unless, as I said earlier, you already accept the entire idea on faith before you start. This is just trying to convince the already faithful that their faith isn't completely misplaced by full-on confirmation bias and wishful thinking. You're really not getting anywhere useful this way, though. Again, we can just insert anything in the place of God, because if they can do it, so can we, and our new syllogism proves absolutely no more than theirs does. You can't just say that Mickey Mouse did it. You have to be able to back that up with some kind of demonstrable evidence, and sadly, they simply can't do that.
The 4th step of the argument is a deductive conclusion that follows logically if the 3 premises are true.
No, it doesn't, because it is just a restatement of the unsupported premise number 2. Again, we have to get back to how this kind of argumentation is supposed to work. Premises are only valid if and only if all parties accept them as such. If one side rejects the premises, then the entire argument fails. That proves two things. First, as we all know, they're only trotting this crap out to people who already accept the ideas for emotional reasons. They sure don't bring this stuff up to skeptics because they know that the skeptics are going to put the brakes on immediately. Secondly, that they're not trying for actual truth because actual truth must be demonstrable in some objective way. You can't just state your beliefs as though they were facts. You actually have to back them up, and the religious simply can't. So right now, both Leibniz and Stratton are complete laughingstocks. I trust nobody's surprised.
Moreover, this also means that if the three premises are merely probably true, then one is completely rational in affirming the final conclusion.
Yet, how do you reach that point without involving blind and empty faith? That's no problem for the religious because that's the only way they operate, but for everybody else, it falls apart catastrophically right there. How do you even determine the probability without some kind of evidence to lend credence to the claim? You can't. Therefore, this isn't about probability, it's about wishful thinking. If you want to argue probability, you need to set up some kind of deterministic standard and a means for figuring out where on the scale the claim actually falls. Your fifis don't matter. Grow the hell up.
So the question is raised, are the premises true or probably true?
No on both counts. I've already pointed out some of the problems with his assertions, and that's all they are. They're just assertions. And if you set aside your emotional attachment to the ideas contained within, what do you have left? Absolutely nothing. But let's see how he rationalizes his way around the reality, because at this point, it's the only thing that he can do.
Well, surely no reasonable person will deny the third premise.
Here's a problem that we're going to see a lot in a lot of fast-talking con men, both religious and otherwise. They will simply declare that anybody who doesn't go along with their claims, well, those people aren't reasonable. They're insane. There's something wrong with them. It gets stated in a lot of different ways, yet you don't get to do that, do you? There certainly may be some people who do reject the third premise. I'm not one of them, and I don't think that those people have any evidence to back it up, but simply denying that it could be true by poisoning the well, that doesn't actually get you anywhere. So let's let him get past this one, because this isn't where the biggest problem lies.
What about the first premise? Is it true or probably true?
Notice which one he's leaving for the very end, right? Because he knows that it doesn't hold water, period. But sure, even here, as I stated, we don't even know if this is true or even probably true. Even if it is true that there is an explanation somewhere, there is still no guarantee that we know what it is, have any means of determining what it might be, or any way of verifying our own ideas without evidence to back it up. Just because you really want it to be God, that doesn't mean that it is. And that's why it all comes down to the second premise, which I'm sure he's just going to hand wave away because he knows that his intended audience already accepts it as an article of faith. But faith doesn't mean anything, does it?
Well, we sure like to find explanations to all things. Indeed, it's the job of the scientist to find explanations.
Looks like he's going to keep trying to put it off for a little bit longer, doesn't it? It is the job of the scientist to try to find explanations. That doesn't mean that we magically just have them all because we want to. There's a lot that we just don't know. If we did, we wouldn't need science anymore, would we? We'd already know it all. So either he doesn't understand the role of science, which is very likely, or he's just lying to people, which is also very likely. That statement simply isn't true in the real world. Come on, Tim, you gotta get to number 2 eventually. Stop shaking in your boots and just do it.
Moreover, it seems that anything and everything must have an explanation of its existence. It's either contingent upon something else, and if it's not, then it must exist necessarily.
Or you just don't know. It exists for a reason that has not and perhaps cannot be determined. Just because you really want to know, that doesn't mean that you do. This is where a lot of philosophers and philosophy geeks go completely wrong. Just because they want to know, they assume that they do know without having gone through the rational steps to actually attain that knowledge. That's not how this works. A given proposition is unknown until you can demonstrate that you have a means to know it, and that must be backed up in some kind of verifiable way, such that anybody can prove out your work without being ideologically dedicated to your conclusion to begin with. And that's why people like Tim only talk to the already religious. They're not going to ask all of the difficult questions that we're going to do, because we're not as stupid as they are.
With that said, the universe sure seems to be a contingent type of thing.
How did you come up with that one? Where's your evidence? Because I see no evidence at all that the universe is contingent on anything, at least not on anything that we can demonstrate. Of course, we don't know. We have no clue what might have come before the universe, if that makes any sense, if anything actually did, but here he's just asserting it because he wants his God to have made it. What you want doesn't matter though, Tim. It's what you can demonstrate that does. You'd better get to work.
Indeed, most scientists would affirm that the universe does not have to exist. After all, if Big Bang cosmology is true, then the universe has not always existed.
And how do you know that? Just because our particular instantiation of space-time hasn't always existed, that doesn't mean it just appeared out of nothing. This is just a bald assertion that they like to throw around because they really want it to be true, but as I said, what you want doesn't mean anything. It's what you can prove that does.
And anything that has ever failed to exist or could fail to exist is necessarily not necessary.
Now, we know what's coming. He's going to assert that his God is necessary, but again, how does he get there without fifis and faith? Because that's all he's got, and it doesn't mean anything. In fact, I don't know that you can get to anywhere that isn't necessary without just making stuff up. What is necessary? What couldn't have been different? I'd really love to see the logic behind that because I don't know that it exists. So Tim hasn't got a thing. He's just yanking it out of his backside and expecting everybody to believe him because, why the hell not? Sorry, but that's just not good enough.
Now, some committed atheists contend that while this is true of everything else, the universe is different. They go on to deny this first premise by saying things like, well, the universe just exists without an explanation, and there is no explanation needed.
Projecting much? Because this is exactly what the religious say about their gods. Whether or not the universe is a brute fact or not, and I don't know that it is, we're really at the point where we can only say that we don't know because, we don't. And Tim here doesn't either, although he plays make-believe and pretends that he does. The only thing that we've established, mostly anyhow, is that the universe is here. How it got here, nobody really has a clue. We've got a lot of ideas, but we don't know for certain. It's the best we can do at the moment. You can't just use it to get any closer to your imaginary friend, though. Stop making a fool of yourself. It doesn't help.
But this commits what is known as the taxicab fallacy. This logical fallacy, an error, occurs when one hops into the taxicab, so to speak, and assumes a certain worldview, attempting to make a particular point, but then jumps out of the system of thought when it goes against a certain presupposition they blindly support.
You mean like you do? Now, let's keep in mind that the taxicab fallacy isn't actually a real fallacy, at least not a formal one. It came about through a remark by 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who pointed out that you can't dismiss the principle of a premise just because you've already arrived at the destination that you'd like to reach. You know, like the religious do. When the religious use it, they are often engaged in a straw man. They will say, in this instance, you can't say that everything has an explanation for its existence, and then say the universe is exempt from that. Except I'm not saying that everything has an explanation for its existence. That's the religious. That's your claim. That's not mine. You're just projecting. If we go all the way back to the beginning of the video, that's the very first premise in his argument. Tim is just pretending that we said it when we didn't. And that's kind of a problem, right?
This is not good reason to reject the premise. So it all comes down to the second premise. But why think that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that this explanation must be God?
Because that's what you want to be true. That's the only reason you do it. If you took this argument and you gave it to the Muslims, for instance, they'd say that the explanation must be Allah. The Hindus would say it must be Brahma. The native people of Hawaii, they would declare that it's Kane, the greatest of their four major deities. The Hakam people of South Africa would say it's Zamaba. The list goes on and on and on and on. Tim is just acknowledging that the people he's making the video for, Christians in this case, they will all automatically assume that God is the creative entity, but that's hardly universal, is it? I'm sure he's got a bald rationalization in reserve somewhere. Let's watch him make a fool of himself.
Well, it's because the universe is everything, including all nature, time, and space.
Then God is nothing? Because if the universe is everything, then God can't be anything if he's not part of the universe. Maybe you should have thought that one through. Of course, it does miss the point entirely. Why, you're God. You haven't even established that your God is real. In fact, nobody has established that any gods are real. This is just a bald assertion, nothing more. And that's the whole problem. You're just assigning responsibility to an imaginary man in the sky without any indication that this entity actually exists. Yet, because he's only talking to those people who already believe it, what difference does that make, right? Faith and fifis, remember? He doesn't have to make a credible case. He just has to flap his lips, and they'll all nod their heads mindlessly because that's what their belief system is. Mindless.
And this means that all nature is contingent upon something other than nature, something supernatural.
What asshole did you yank that one out of? This is just another empty claim. Please define the supernatural for us. Make sure you have some means of testing your claim. Just because you propose an emotionally comforting nonsense idea, that doesn't actually get you anywhere. Tim is just being an idiot, which is hardly a surprise. This is why faith doesn't get you anywhere, because faith doesn't come up with any demonstrable explanations. It's just shit you happen to like, and that's not remotely credible. Do try again.
All space is contingent upon something spaceless. It's because the universe is everything nature, time, and space, including all nature, time, and space.
Exactly how do you know that? He's just making more claims that I don't think many people outside of his little mind poison are going to agree with. What is this spaceless thing anyhow? How do you demonstrate that it exists? This is as stupid as, what is the sound of one hand clapping? It doesn't actually get you anywhere. We're looking for coherent, rational, defensible positions, and Tim clearly doesn't have one. He just has wishes and dreams. Stop being an idiot, Tim. It's not a good look.
This means that all nature is contingent upon something supernatural. All space is contingent upon something spaceless, and thus immaterial, since matter requires space. All time is contingent upon something timeless, and thus eternal, without beginning.
Again, says who? I mean, I know that we're not going to get anywhere intelligent with Tim because Tim isn't trying to make a coherent case for anything but his childish feelings. It's why they really don't want to talk to us, do they? We just sit there and laugh and laugh and laugh at this idiocy, and they can't make any money off of anybody who's just laughing too hard to pull out their wallet, can they? So far as we know, there isn't any such thing as timeless either. What is timeless? At least it isn't anything that anybody can show is actually real. He just wants to think that his imaginary friend can zippity-doo-dah things out of nowhere, and forgive me, but that's just ridiculously dumb.
A supernatural, spaceless, immaterial, timeless, eternal, and beginningless, which also seems to exist by a necessity of its own nature kind of thing, in which the universe is contingent, seems to be what we mean by God. Therefore, God exists.
So, you just defined your imaginary friend into existence because that's what you really want to believe. How stupid is that? It might be what you mean by God, but how about I decide that's what I mean by invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies? Does that mean that the pixies done it now? Because this is really idiotic. You can't just define your solution into existence by arbitrarily making up characteristics that you can't demonstrate actually exist and saying, "See, I told you so." It's positively moronic, but this is Tim Stratton we're talking about, right?
For more on the Leibnizian cosmological argument, check out the work of Dr. William Lane Craig at reasonablefaith.org.
If you don't buy my line of made-up bullshit, then go listen to somebody else who has more made-up bullshit. Yeah, no thanks. Come back when you have some actual evidence to support any of your claims. Hopefully that means we don't have to see these lunatics ever again, because wouldn't that be nice? Thereafter, he just tries to sell stuff, and I think we can ignore that. This whole thing was really pretty embarrassing for Tim, and that's why they're not making this content for anybody that exists beyond their childish little religious bubble. They can't back any of this up, and they don't even try. See? All the things that you already believe for no good reason are true. Yeah, about that. This is just mindlessly idiotic, but what can you expect? These people aren't exercising good evidence-based reasoning. They just want to believe. Yet just wanting to believe isn't good enough. You have to have a demonstrable reason to think that your beliefs are factually true, and they don't have anything like that, do they? They also don't care. If they did, they wouldn't keep looking like imbeciles dancing a jig with collection plates at the ready, because really, that's all they're after. Your money. Want to know how I know that? Because if you go into the description, all of their recommended resources are books that Frank Turek wrote and wants to make money from. Funny how that works, right? No, not funny. Funny isn't the right word. I mean pathetic and really entirely transparent. What a maroon. It's about time we just laughed in their faces because they're just being idiots. Who's with me?